Welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This is a series hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to see so many of you joining us today. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. As a heads up for a couple of things today for our talk, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box anytime you feel comfortable. Just know that we do hold the questions until the end. We do try to get to as many as possible, but just forgive us if we can't get to yours. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat box shortly. Make sure you open that when you get it. And for those of you that are pursuing APA continuing education credits, there will be a link posted in about the last 5 to 10 minutes or so of the talk. Make sure you open that link before you leave, and make sure once you complete the survey that you save your certificate, because we don't have access to those and we don't keep copies of them. There will be a recording and PowerPoint slides for this talk available sometime later in the week. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Natalie Anumba, who will be discussing issues of equity in psych and law. But that's for next week. This week, I'd like to introduce you to the speaker that we've been waiting for. Today's speaker will be discussing advocacy and social justice work as a clinical and forensic psychologist. This is Dr. Apryl Alexander. Dr. Apryl Alexander is the Metrolina Medical Foundation Distinguished Scholar in Health and Public Policy at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Florida Institute of Technology with concentrations in forensic psychology and child and family therapy. Dr. Alexander's research and clinical work focus on violence and victimization, human sexuality, and trauma-informed and culturally informed practice. She's an award-winning researcher, and her work has been published in several leading journals. She's also been interviewed by numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, USA Today, and the NBC Nightly News about her research and advocacy work. Also, as a personal note, I believe Dr. Alexander represents in the field that you really can do it all. Considered a great researcher, mentor, teacher, policy analyst, advocate, and above all, human being. So Dr. Alexander, Apryl, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, can I say we're excited to have you joining our series and thankful that you'll be sharing your insights and expertise with us today. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
And thank you so much for that lovely intro, Anthony. Just a pleasure to be here. Good day, everyone. Since I know we're all on different time zones. Again, I'm Dr. Apryl Alexander, currently at UNC Charlotte in our Department of Public Health Sciences. And I'm just really excited to be here to talk to you all about what advocacy and social justice could look like in clinical and forensic psychology. This has been an area of interest of mine over the last few years for a number of different reasons, both personal and professional, as I've navigated these last several years of my career in spaces when working with youth in the juvenile justice system. And then also from my students. My students have had a lot of questions, have engaged with me in a lot of dialogue about what it means to be an advocate in psychology. That there's a lot of controversy on whether or not we can have a role as an advocate in psychology and specifically forensic psychology. So I invite you all today to kind of have an open mind, think about what this could look like, and I hope we also can engage in some dialogue around this. I think this is important to kind of think about our current climate, both here nationally in the United States and globally, around all the things that we're thinking about with relation to the criminal legal system or the juvenile legal systems. If you open the newspaper, and I did this in preparation for this presentation today, we're seeing all sorts of things around what does criminal justice reform look like? How do we engage in healing or collective thought around racial justice issues in our nation? And when I think about all these things, I think about how can psychology aid in this? That if we're using social sciences, whether it's psychology, psychiatry, social work, and other forms of social sciences, where are we at the table in thinking about these injustices that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis? You know, for us, we're thinking about in the United States that we have this issue of mass incarceration. What is our role in thinking about how do we find solutions to this crisis of mass incarceration? Do we have a role in it? Or do we sit back and watch the status quo happen? The systems work in the way that they've been historically working in, and we are just passersby and seeing these injustices. I'm hoping that we can think of something different, challenge ourselves to find solutions. And many of you who are attending today are already doing this work, whether it's as a direct care staff, as a practitioner, as an evaluator. You're probably already engaging in some of this work, but I want us to become more thoughtful and deliberate in how we engage in social justice and advocacy. Because maybe our training models didn't always center this work. Particularly in psychology, we have 3 core areas of our training models, whether it's the scientist practitioner model, practitioner scholar, and kind of thinking about applied work, or the clinical scientist model. But in recent years, people have been thinking about what were to happen if we added advocate to that model, that we are consuming this social science research. We're thinking about how we apply it to the work that we're doing with clients. And what would it mean to engage in an advocacy role? What would it look like for us to train our students to become the next generation of advocates? What would it mean for existing psychologists to maybe shift their lens and the way of thinking to become an advocate for psychology? And this isn't new. I think for myself, I reflect on my early training, and I don't know if we were saying the word social justice or advocacy as much as we are today. So even for myself, I had to do some digging on what could my role in all of this look like. And in some of that, we've had people who've been established advocates for psychology since its existence, and then throughout time. I really like this article, which highlights a number of different ways that psychologists and psychiatrists have been involved in advocacy over the years, and our professional organizations being at the forefront of some of these advocacy efforts. So in some of this, I think we need to define what social justice and advocacy truly means. Sometimes when I talk to my colleagues and say the word advocacy, they tell me, oh, I don't want to go marching out in the streets. And I said, that's not exactly what I'm telling you to do, or what I'm even encouraging you to think about. Even with social justice, it's becoming a really kind of polarized term right now. It's become divisive and really kind of thinking about what it means and what it looks like to engage in social justice efforts. And when it comes down to looking at various definitions of social justice, it just means the fair and equitable status of all individuals and groups. So thinking about what equitable access to economic, political, social rights and opportunities would look like in our climate. As we're having some difficult conversations about race-conscious admissions in higher education, how are we providing equitable access to all individuals to have a right to higher education? And so for us, thinking about our role in these systems, particularly in the criminal legal system, all I want us to do in thinking about social justice advocacy is thinking about how are we championing for the basic human and civil rights of all people? What would that look like? If we have individuals who are currently facing life in prison, who are currently exposed to conditions that are inhumane, what would it look like for us to alleviate those conditions for people, or even advocate for better conditions for individuals who are incarcerated? And then Hanowitz provides a variety of different definitions of advocacy, which I really like and often circulates in my work. That one, we could engage in public policy advocacy, thinking about how we can use our research and our science to influence decision makers who can change the policies we want to see changed. So how are we disseminating our research in a way that is accessible for people to consume, and maybe even change minds about certain topics or make people become more informed? I've already defined social justice advocacy, again, just thinking about all intersecting identities and how do we champion for basic human and civil rights for all people. And then professional advocacy is a blend of both. One, I think about this in terms of how do we engage in client-centered advocacy. We know that some of our clients don't have fair access to services, so how do we get them fair access to services? I also think about this in terms of professional advocacy for ourselves. If we know that there are still pay disparities in what psychologists, psychiatrists make, how do we alleviate that? I talk to my students about student loan repayment options. That's an area of professional advocacy for individuals. So advocacy is broadly defined, and I think it's been poorly or ill-defined in the past. but really taking a broad lens on the different ways in which we can engage in advocacy efforts over time. And why do I talk about this? I think it's an ethics issue. And again, if we look at various ethical guidelines, and you see I pulled some from psychology, counseling, marital and family therapy, social work, et cetera, a lot of them have these guiding principles of beneficence and justice. So justice is naturally embedded in there. And so thinking about in our day-to-day practice, each of you as individuals and thinking about your own specialty, how does justice come up in your work? What are you doing in your daily work to make sure that justice is being upheld? We are often observing inequities in our systems. What are we doing about it? How are we considering that? Is this coming to your conversations in supervision, consultation, administrative meetings? Where are we trying to deliberately, intentionally think about justice in our work? And Hanowitz did another survey, really thinking about what are our barriers to involvement in advocacy. And what they found in surveying both students, alums, staff, faculty members of graduate programs, it came down to these three areas. That one, disinterest might be a topic for people. Some people are genuinely not interested in engaging in advocacy, whether that's their own interpersonal style or they don't believe there's a need for advocacy. But the main one I often see when I'm interacting with people is they don't believe that their participation in advocacy can have an effect on systems. They say, well, nobody's going to listen to me. It's not even going to matter. I'm just one person. And again, I hope we can debunk some of those myths a little bit later. Or they've had a poor past experience. So I went to the state capitol, I testified, it was very traumatic, the bill didn't get passed, and I don't want to ever do it again. So we have that bubble of disinterest. Next is thinking about uncertainty. This is the other area that I often see with students and trainees. They think that I don't have enough knowledge, I don't feel persuasive enough, that I don't have the skills and tools in order to engage in effective advocacy. Again, I challenge this. A lot of the work in our training programs prepares us for this area of being able to discuss our knowledge in an appropriate way, in a concise manner, just thinking about how we do class presentations, how we testify in court. All of those skills make us an effective advocate. And then the last one is unawareness. So this could be twofold. So lack of awareness of public advocacy issues. So one thing I do as a professor is I often bring current events to each and every one of my classes. Again, usually current events centered on the theme of that course. So when I taught a treatment and assessment of juvenile offenders, a lot of my news articles would come around what's happening in news pertaining to youth in the criminal legal system. And that way we could build awareness to individuals about the core issues that are occurring. Maybe we're busy, maybe we're on social media burnouts, but some people are just not consuming the news information and aren't aware of the issues that are happening in their own community. So making sure that we're taking the time to build our own awareness of issues that are happening in our environment. And then the last part, which I think is still major, and that's what I want to talk about today, is people are unaware of the opportunities to advocate. So I know the problem, I know potential solutions, but where do I go with that? How do I meet with a representative in my community to talk about the social science? How do I go about doing that? So that lack of awareness of how we become engaged in this work is one of the areas that is a barrier to involvement. So I often encourage people to sit back and kind of think about these three areas that came up in the research, and there's probably more, and think about where you sit on this. Are you in that place of disinterest, or are you more on the spectrum of uncertainty and unawareness? And how can we all work together in order to build up our repertoire of how to engage in this work? The other issue that comes up, especially when I'm talking to forensic psychologists, those in psych and law, they often bring up the issue of how do we balance some of our ethical demands to be impartial or objective with engaging in advocacy? How do we reconcile some of that work? And I really love this article that I came across a few years ago, which talked about that dilemma that a lot of us are having, that some of you are in roles where you're actively serving as expert witnesses, and you don't want to have maybe this history of people perceiving you as though you are biased. Again, I challenge that we all know the research on bias. We do all have some form of bias, so we can't eliminate that completely. But again, where do we go with balancing this area of being objective and engaging in this work? I think we naturally do engage in advocacy, even if we're serving as expert witnesses. The role of the expert witness is to educate and inform the trier of fact. And I hope we are engaging them in conversations and in educating them and informing them of the key issues that are at hand that are relevant to the case. And some of that is bringing up the relevant research that is out there on the defendant, on the critical issues surrounding the social science. We're doing that, and that is, I think, inherently advocacy. Making sure that we are providing information to the courts in the best way possible to make sure we are doing justice by the system. So in one of the lines in this article, they said this article, which has this whole dialogue, explains why pitting integrity against advocacy is a false choice. So thinking about how this comes up in our work. If you're working with youth on a Miller case and you're informing the courts on adolescent developmental issues, I think that's essentially advocacy. We want to inform the courts and the trier of fact on what are the key issues at hand, what's the history, what's the case law behind some of these issues. I think that's inherently advocacy. Again, people might disagree, but I think that's us representing the science well to the public, to the trier of fact. So I want to spend some time giving some advocacy engagement examples. Again, I think I came to a point in my early career where I loved the work that I was doing, again, doing direct care for individuals who were in the criminal legal system, doing assessment, doing treatment. But I often observed all these systemic inequities that were happening within the system. Being a Black woman and going into a facility and seeing disproportionate minority contact being played out, that did something to me. Watching these youth who were being placed on the sex offense registry, probably for the rest of their lives, even though I knew that they were doing incredible work in treatment and probably wouldn't reoffend again, that hurt me. So I thought, what can I do as an individual and maybe as a collective, maybe there are other people thinking about these ideas in order to change the systems and change the social conditions of the people that I hope I'm serving. So I think that was the point in time in my own life where I wanted to really rethink of my career and how I'm engaging in this work. Even in my research, how do I take my research and what's being published in peer-reviewed journal articles and get it out to the people who need to see the research? Do I have a plan for that? The answer was no at the time. Dissemination just meant we get the article published, not really thinking about the power and impact that that could have. So these next few slides talk about some advocacy engagement examples from myself and some that I've observed with colleagues of mine to really generate ideas on where you are going to engage in this work. No one model is going to fit for everyone. You might not want to engage in media advocacy because that's just not your style. But maybe you're a strong writer and you want to write op-eds, or maybe you are the one who wants to talk to legislators. So the goal of this session today is to figure out what is an advocacy style that fits for you. First is thinking about engaging in that legislative advocacy. So again, how do we get our research, our knowledge to the hands of decision makers, especially policymakers? I was living in the state of Colorado for 6 years. I'm actually currently in Breckenridge now. If you see the weird decor behind me, I'm at a ski resort. I was in Colorado for 6 years. And again, that's when I really wanted to commit myself to engaging in this work. And really just asking community questions about what's happening in a community that we're concerned about that could have an intersecting psychology or psych and law lens. The picture on the right is me testifying on a bill to ban licensed mental health practitioners from practicing conversion therapy in Colorado. That bill failed 3 years in a row before passing in its 4th year. The one on the left is the Crown Act, which is an act to end hair discrimination. In fact, a colleague of mine just sent me an article right before I hopped on today, talking about an Indigenous youth who were getting their hair cut unwillingly against their will, just due to hair discrimination, and just really sad. And I remember talking about the Crown Act with my students, and they say, this is really important, but Apryl, what does hair have to do with psychology? And I said, let's dig a little bit deeper. What do we know about the impacts of discrimination on youth? What does that do to their self-esteem, their self-concept, if they can't be their authentic, natural selves? What does that mean in the long run for those youth? What does it mean for youth who are being pushed out of schools, being disciplined for having their hair in braids, locks, and afros? Could that lead to some of the problems that we're noticing in the school to prison pipeline? And that's when my students got it. They said, yeah, maybe psychology and hair do have to deal with each other. So really getting us to think critically about the spaces that we can show up in order to change laws, being able to build relationships with our legislators so that they do know about our presence in the work that we do. So if you're publishing an article, have you ever thought of sending a one-page summary to your state representative about your research? They might be seeing a bill that is quite relevant to the research that you're conducting right now. So what if you sent a one-pager or infographic to tell them about the work that you're doing? And so getting in the habit of building these skills and building these relationships has been so fruitful for me in community of building these connections with decision makers. I also think about systems level advocacy. Again, I think in the criminal legal system, we all can point out areas that need reform or even dismantling in some ways. And a lot of you are aware of the competency crisis that is facing folks from across the country, really, and even internationally, as we've been talking to colleagues in South Africa and other places. If we're noticing these concerns, we might have some ideas and solutions from our work that might aid in transforming some of the policy around competency restoration. And one of my colleagues, Neil Goen-Smith, has been instrumental in some of this work, being able to talk to state policymakers about areas that could be reformed. How do we provide better support to forensic mental health systems during this crisis? How do we get more individuals at the master's level paid in order to do this work, since they do have the training in order to do it well? And so not just writing about it, but taking it to the people who need to see this work in order to transform the systems that we are seeing that are currently in crisis. And again, that's taken him to being exposed to new positions that himself and Dan Murray here in Colorado became the special masters who were able to evaluate the forensic mental health systems in here pertaining to competency restoration and make some meaningful recommendations. Yes, the crisis is still happening because we have all sorts of systemic level problems, but these recommendations have been really transformative in getting systems to think about how do we alleviate this crisis? How do we think about new ideas like outpatient restoration in certain communities? And so, again, having your research out there, having that presence known gets us in positions where we are able to make recommendations to systems. You know, for myself, I was doing some work with youth in Alabama around engagement in the arts, that I was engaged in the arts as a youth. I was a theater kid for a long time, but pushed that away for a few years as I went into higher education, but always thought about the importance of theater and creative arts and self-expression. So I did some work in that area with youth in Alabama. And then when I moved to Colorado, thought about how can I revamp some of this? And so partnering with a theater professor who had some experience in New York with providing creative and therapeutic arts in prison systems. So myself and Ashley Hamilton developed the DU Prison Arts Initiative, which did just that. These are some pictures from Sterling Correctional Facility, max security, about 3 hours north of Denver, where she was doing some work with the individuals in these facilities and thinking about the importance that can make for many of these individuals in the picture are lifers, but lifers who want to make amends for their actions, who are thinking about things like restorative and transformative justice. And then for people to kind of vocalize their own stories and their expressions. What does it mean for these men who are going to be behind the walls of this prison for the rest of their lives to have something that gives them hope, that gives them encouragement, and can also tell stories of repair. While this seems like just kind of a novelty program, I think this is a program that can have some transformative work and some transformative meaning on some of the lives of individuals who are incarcerated. And again, just taking opportunities even at the state, city, national, international level to sit on boards and commissions or task forces that are happening in our lives. So in addition to my role as a scholar activist, as a professor, I was also a community organizer in Denver. Denver has had some issues related to police excessive force over the years. And over the time, they developed a citizen oversight board, which is an independent council, which helps assist with policing policy in the city of Denver. So there was an opening to apply for this board. It's actually an elected position by either the mayor or the Denver City Council. And I applied. I said, I want to have an opportunity to look at policing policy. Again, bring in the social science literature on policing for this board. And then it was a very critical time. This was in 2020, as you can see from this article, where we were having discussions after the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd on what policing could look like. So at that time, again, I applied and was appointed unanimously by the Denver City Council to participate in this board, which provided a lot of rich recommendations about policing and protests during that time in 2020. So I often encourage people to, again, get involved in their communities. Go to your website for the city and state level boards and commissions, particularly ones that you can apply to, and see which ones you can have a position in that can transform certain policy in your community. There have been ones related to commuting sentences and helping the governor make decisions about that I've seen friends apply for. There have been ones related to human trafficking or the Indigenous missing and murdered women crisis. And so depending on your area of specialty, there's probably a board or commission that probably fits your area of interest. Another section, again, that I've alluded to before is how do we get our research out into the public? How do we make it accessible for people to read and consume and maybe change perceptions of the folks that we're working with or change perceptions about laws and policies? From the titles of these articles, you can see that the public has critiqued researchers about the lack of access they're getting to research and the results. That often we're having people be involved in our studies as participants, the public as our participants, where we might be doing community-based action research, but how are they getting those results back? Even if a person wanted to look up one of my research articles, they're going to be hit with a paywall. So how do we make that work accessible to them, especially since public dollars are often funding our research? And again, the public is often our participants in research. So there's a lot of kind of concern about this interaction of how do we get research to the public and how does the public also be engaged in research with us. So the notion of public impact scholarship has come up in recent years, especially in a lot of other fields like economics and business, to get us to think about creative ways in which we can get our research out to the public in different venues outside of a peer-reviewed journal article. So this could be in the form of blogs, various forms of social media. I know social media usage right now is very controversial, but thinking about different types of social media engagement, podcasts, webinars, op-eds, public reports and position papers, books, TED Talks, just thinking about ways that are going to have this public impact and get a lot of people engaged in our work. And also writing it in a way that the public can consume it. That sometimes we do write in an academic language that makes it hard for people to read or understand our journal articles. So how can we break down the kind of core concepts of those journal articles and get it out and disseminate it in these other forms? So one of those examples is I woke up one morning and was reading the news and came across this news article. Jeannie Bunsen, aunt accused of killing a 7-year-old Jordan Vong, appears in Denver court. This was kind of later down the line, but still the early articles were Jeannie Bunsen, aunt accused of killing 7-year-old. Again, I don't know if I would click on every single article pertaining to a murder, but I thought that the article title read a little bit different and strange. So in the upcoming days after the murder of Jordan Vong and they found his body, the picture of Jeannie Bunsen came out. This wasn't the picture I imagined when I saw Aunt in the initial article. Again, in the days to come, we found out Jeannie was a teenage girl who was in charge of babysitting her 7-year-old nephew, got frustrated and unintentionally probably killed her nephew. And when I went to the article after her mugshot was posted, this mugshot was posted, and you look at the comments section, which I usually tell people never to do, all sorts of biases were coming out of just, this girl looks dead in the eyes. She looks like a thug, lock her up. She's going to be a psychopath for the rest of her life. So I think for myself, I sat there and paused of, wait a second. One, we didn't have all the details about the case just yet. She had her first court appearance and no family, it said in the articles, were present. So that made me curious. And so bringing my questions, curiosity, and even expertise in this field to write an op-ed. Of thinking about the work that has been done around talking about teens who are being tried as an adult in a lot of states and bringing that issue to the forefront. Also thinking about the Supreme Court has changed their ways of thinking about youth in the criminal legal system over the last 20 years or so, and how that can have an influence on how we think about this case and think about maybe some of the questions that we don't have answered yet, because again, this was just high profile in the media. But giving them some of the background on how we're thinking about this in the field of psych and law and what this could look like, and how, again, we want to see justice served both for the victim and the person who committed the offense, particularly since it was a teenager. So can we take some time when we're seeing these high profile news stories to write an op-ed to educate the public on the issues at hand for this particular case? Again, if you think that you might have the potential of evaluating Jeannie, you might not want to write an op-ed. But if this is slightly outside, this might be an opportunity to educate the public. It was interesting because Jeannie ultimately wasn't convicted in adult court and had a much reduced sentence. And one of the people who actually worked with her in treatment was a former student. So just seeing even across the career span, how this all plays out with a once student was now on the treatment end and testifying on how well Jeannie was doing in treatment. And so public impact scholarship, again, thinking about those opportunities to engage in this work. I was quite fortunate that in 2018, the University of Denver had a public impact fellows program that was created by our vice provost of research in collaboration with our media and marketing team to help train professors and faculty across campus on how to engage in public impact scholarship. So for a year, we had workshops on how to write op-eds, how to talk to media. So they brought a big camera, put it in front of you, give us your 2-minute spiel on your research topic area. How to work with legislators in order to get your research out to them. So it was a really rich program that was really successful. The initial 20 faculty who were enrolled have now had hundreds of media appearances among all of us. And then they continued it in the years to come. But that gave me some of the skills as well as the confidence to be able to do some of this work. When we had a school shooting here in Colorado, the governor had been invited to our campus weeks prior to the school shooting, but they had to ask him about it. And he said, what are you going to do about school shootings here in Colorado? It just keeps happening. And he says, first and foremost, we're going to do school resource officers. We're going to increase them. And right as soon as it was over, I went home and I said, that's not going to be the only solution. We need to be thinking about creative ways and thinking about, again, the impact of school to prison pipeline. So I was able to write the op-ed you see at the top there to, again, inform the public about some of the issues that we're thinking about in terms of school violence. So again, seeking opportunities to engage in this work that can have public dissemination. Even with the TED Talks, again, thinking about journal articles and how they get disseminated and how they get out there, how many views do they get from the public? I'm not so sure. I don't even know if we collect that data. But a 12 to 15-minute TED Talk can quickly get millions of views. And so seeing some of my colleagues engage in some of this work and their TED Talks get millions of views, that is big impact. That is getting a message, getting our research out in a way that we could have never imagined, that now now I'm on the advisory board for the TEDx Mile High team. And we've been having conversations in our board meetings about, how are we measuring impact? For them, they were measuring it in terms of views, but I said, it's so much more. That after my TED Talk, I was having meetings with community members for months afterwards of wanting to engage in dialogue more about the topic that I spoke about. And the same goes for, again, my colleagues, being able to take their talk and the results of their research and transform it into a compelling TED Talk, which then has this big impact. And so that's what I want people to think of now is, again, advocacy and research and what that could look like. When you, as an individual or you with a research team, when you're thinking about developing a study, I want you to be thinking in advance what public impact could look like for that study. Where do you hope your results will go? I want in every single journal article, we're starting to get there with the practical implications section, and a few journals are doing a policy implication section. I want that in every journal. I want every dissertation to have a policy implication section, because I think in all of our different areas of research, there probably is some policy implication, whether that's institutional, whether that's governmental, there's probably some policy implication there. And so how do we take our line of research and really transform it into those spheres to get out to the public and have some impact? So again, 2020 occurred and the COVID-19, again, pandemic happened. And myself and my students, we had to sit down and I think in that time we were just, I think in so much disarray. Between that and the racial injustices, we just needed a pause of what are we doing in our research team? Does our research even matter right now? And for us, we said we need to pivot for a second, that a lot of people are in crisis, and how do we talk about the crisis that people are in, and also talk about the most vulnerable people at this time where we're having the racial injustices and the COVID-19 pandemic. So even for us, we changed parts of our line of research to talk about these current events and current topics. So my students were still going into their practicums in jails and correctional settings, them not being provided with PPE, and then them having concerns about those who were incarcerated and the staff in those facilities who were susceptible to COVID-19 virus. So being able to write an article on, can we rethink this? What are the policy issues that are pertaining to incarceration at that time? We were seeing states like California engage in decarceration policies. Are there some people who could be released safely from our correctional institutions? And that would help mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. And again, we saw some great successes in California, and then being able to talk about how social science can inform those decisions. Because early on in the pandemic in Colorado, our governor said, yeah, decarceration, I've heard of it, but I don't want to release violent prisoners. And we said, we didn't ask you to do that. Let's engage in this practice called smart decarceration and think about the people that could be released safely into our communities and being able to talk about that. And then again, myself and student Emma Sawyer wanted to talk about what are the impacts of COVID-19 on individuals who are experiencing interpersonal violence during COVID, recognizing that we were seeing some of the domestic violence shelters close, problems in the homeless shelters until that was reconfigured in community. And what do our policymakers need to know about these issues, especially in creating social safety nets and continued funding for individuals who had experienced harm during the pandemic. So I think these were kind of examples of myself and my research team really thinking about in the here and now, when people are in crisis, what are the main issues we can be talking about that are relevant to the research that we're already doing. And another one of those examples came out again from the same group of students as we saw the Ahmaud Arbery death happen in Georgia. Of, what does this mean in this time that we're already talking about the Black Lives Matter movement? What kind of piece and say can we have in this? And is there much research on that area? So being able to ask questions about what is the public's perception of these castle doctrine or stand your ground laws? How much does the public know about them? Especially since they're being evoked so often, especially when there is a Black victim. How are we thinking about these laws and what needs to be changed when we're thinking about justifiable homicide? And so again, we published this paper, it came out, and then a few weeks later, we had that shooting of Ralph Yarl. And again, my research team, they're now in doc programs, but being able to come together and think about what are our next steps in this. We conducted this study, which we were already concerned about years ago, and we're still continuing to see a crisis of the use of justifiable homicide, self-defense laws in our society. And so we're continuing on with this line of research right now. Again, I hope I created some ideas and generated some thoughts and feelings about how you can engage in some of these different areas of advocacy through your research, through dissemination of your knowledge and your research to the public. Again, this is only 1 hour, so I just want to make sure I'm leaving you with some additional resources. The APA's Advocacy Office, the American Psychological Association's Advocacy Office, has a wealth of resources, particularly for people who are interested in engaging in policy change at the federal level. Obviously, we need you in the here and now, particularly on any of these different health topics and more. So being able to go to their website, you can sign up for a lot of their policy action alerts. Again, in that area of not being informed, find out who your senator or representative is. So that way, when you need to get your research out and it's relevant to a current federal policy issue, you can send them an email immediately. There's some great guides to advocacy that even give you templates on how to write a letter to your senator or representative. And so, again, lots of great resources there. One day, I hope to do one of the APA policy fellowships. Being involved in the offices in the Congress, and again, being able to be an advocate for psychological science at the congressional level. There's these one-year policy fellowships. Encourage you all to check them out. I've heard great things about them, and maybe this is something that you want to plan at some point in your career as well as me. And then a group of great folks came together in a task force and created this community psychology advocacy toolkit. Again, gives some additional advice on how to engage in advocacy at the state and local level. Great templates on how to write a letter to your legislator, how to create some of these one-pagers. So this is another resource that I encourage you to seek out, and we'll make sure that you have links to all this afterwards. And then if you're thinking about engaging in some of this public dissemination, public scholarship, engaging in the media work, a couple of different wealths of resources out there. One, the Op-Ed Project. A lot of resources on their website on developing an op-ed and some things that you need to know. They also, often for a cost, will come out to organizations or universities to do some like 2-day trainings on op-ed writing. I'll tell you, as a professor, I teach a health policy and leadership course. And part of that course, they have to develop a policy analysis. And then after they develop the policy analysis, they have to write an op-ed based off of that policy analysis. And I give extra credit if you're able to publish that that op-ed before the end of the semester. And I had 2 students successfully publish their op-eds before the end of the semester. So that was just a great example. It built their confidence up, getting these op-eds in the paper. They've had some great feedback and reactions from community from being able to publish those op-eds. So that was something that I was even able to build into my curriculum. The Scholar Strategy Network, again, that is also a resource for scholars who want to engage in this public impact scholarship, but need some more resources. Maybe you've had a few media appearances, you can get into this network. You can insert a bunch of your different topic areas, and media outlets can also reach out to you when they are needing experts on particular topic areas. Which reminds me, the American Psychological Association also has a media referral service option on their website where you can sign up, upload your CV, upload your areas of interest, and they will seek you out for these different topic areas when members of the media reach out to them. So a lot of great resources out there to explore if you're interested in that work. Now, I want to be clear that there are challenges to engaging in this work, and I'm still trying to process these last few years in engaging, especially in the public impact work. And also thinking about our current sociopolitical climate and some of the challenges that it poses to engaging in advocacy work. That one, there are institutional barriers. Maybe you can't engage in some level of advocacy in your institution or on behalf of the institution in the role that you're in. Maybe they want you to engage into all this work outside of your role on your own free time. This applies to a lot of federal employees. So just thinking about that. This can also mean the institutional climate is changing. So if prisons and correctional systems are banning books that are talking about issues of diversity, mass incarceration, et cetera, then we're going to be limited in what we can do in that environment without getting you in trouble and things like that. So I want us to think carefully of that, of what this could mean. Yes, advocacy does have risk, and we do need to think about that and what risk you're willing to take. And then thinking about, are there ways that we can work around this and pivot around this, just given these institutional barriers and institutional climates. And then the ongoing legislative changes, that's what makes giving this type of presentation harder and harder each time I do it, is just from state to state, there's just so much going on with legislation that might be hindering, again, our capacity to see immediate change. Advocacy is a long-term sport. It's also not a solo sport. We have to do this in community. We have to do this together, and we might not see change overnight. So one of the common questions I get during these presentations is, how do you stay motivated? And one of my ending messages is we can't be complacent. And so again, how do we work together as a collective to see the changes we want to see, particularly in the systems that we work in? And that's probably my ending message is really, I hope that you are thinking about how you can intentionally, deliberately integrate these different concepts of advocacy, activism, allyship, which I didn't have a lot of time to talk about today, social justice into our work. That communities do want us there. They do need us. And how do we work with them in order to see the changes that we want to see? Particularly when we're talking about the criminal legal system, which again, we've long known is in need of reform. We also need to be thinking about this from an interprofessional advocacy lens. One of the things I've appreciated and that's contributed to my success in a lot of this work is being able to work with so many different people, from community activists to folks who are working in nonprofits, to lawyers, to social workers. We're all working together with our different lenses to make sure equity is happening, to make sure justice is happening. And so I think if we're continuing to do trainings on this work, if we're continuing to have discussions on what success looks like, we need to be thinking about this from an interprofessional lens. So often we get really buckled down into our silos, and sometimes we need that creativity to get outside of this. I was even on a panel during the pandemic, and on that panel was several artists. And they were talking about things like abolition, which is one of the articles we also worked on in the pandemic. And they said, one of the reasons why you all can't think of abolition is because you're not an artist. You can't think outside of the box like we can. You're not thinking as creatively as we can on solutions that would help facilitate change. And those quotes had stuck with me ever since of, again, we can't be sticking with the status quo at all times. And maybe there are areas that we need change. And I wouldn't have had that if I wasn't sitting next to these amazing artists. And then in some of this work, I think we need transformational leadership. If we are getting outside the status quo, who are we going to have that are going to be our change agents, that are going to be advocating for us to advocate? So thinking about our own leadership styles, thinking about the people that we put in positions of leadership, who are our change agents going to be? Well, we have over 400 people here today, and many of you are in leadership or administrative positions. For those who aren't, you're going to be. So I want you to think about what type of leader you want to be, and how you are thinking about transforming these systems, and how you're thinking about, as a leader, how you're integrating advocacy, activism, allyship, and social work into your work. So I would like to thank you all for having me in this space. Again, I think as I've done these presentations over the last couple of years, just being able to engage in exchange of dialogue on how do we make this work? How do we elevate our work in order to dismantle some of these systems of oppression that exist and best help all of our clients who walk through our doors? So I'm going to post the end survey for you all. for a couple seconds, and then we are going to have Anthony come on and kick us off in the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Apryl, Dr. Alexander, for a really inspiring broad-based talk that I think gave people both generalized and really personalized introspection in order to think about how they can be an advocate in the field or in particular areas of the work that they do. There are the links for the CE credits have been already posted, available in the chat. We do have a couple of questions that have been posted. For those of you that have any additional questions for Dr. Alexander, enter those in the Q&A box whenever you are inspired or whenever you see fit. One of the very early things that you had mentioned, which seemed like it could be a barrier for early career people in particular, is feeling like they don't have that expertise to share, or just being reluctant on whether they know enough. From your experience, what have been some particularly effective things of helping people get over that hump and get out there and share their expertise?
Yeah, and the term expertise is always a challenge too, because in some of my classes, one of the projects that we do is you have to deliver legislative testimony. So in Colorado, you typically get 3 minutes to speak in front of committee on a particular bill. So in this class, I give you 5 minutes to deliver your legislative testimony, and it has to be psychologically informed, but for some of my students, it's personal narrative too. So it has been bills on eating disorders, and I have students who've been in recovery. So not only have they researched it, they've experienced themselves, and you can bring both to the table. Students who've been in the foster care system, that kind of expertise is just as important as the science. So you do have it, your own narrative, and what you see from community is they're bringing their own narratives to the table in some of this. Again, you've written papers, you've written a whole dissertation for our early career folks. Where are you taking that dissertation in terms of engaging in this work? That I hope in our time, in our training, you are developing some sense of expertise, even if you don't feel like it, to do this work. My first lecture, I show a clip of I think an 8-year-old boy. There was a city in Colorado that banned snowball fights. And so he went to city council and testified on why we need to have snowball fights in that city, and he won. 8 years old, changed policy. So I said, if the 8-year-old can do it, you all have no excuses.
Wow, that's wonderful. Yes. Somebody asked, prefacing that this was a wonderful presentation, that they appreciate your thoughtfulness and passion related to the topic, and wanted to know, when you shared those resources, do you have any resources specifically for those of us who work in prison settings? I loved your reference to implementing arts and expressive interventions. If you have any resources related to that approach, it would be appreciated.
I don't know if it's direct resources, but I think some of that work just comes from an idea. That came from an idea. I initially in Auburn, when I started this project with the boys who were incarcerated, I was doing a presentation on campus. Somebody from the theater program was doing a presentation on campus. We were like, hey, both of us are cool. Can we talk more about this and what it would look like to collaborate? And then talking to the administrators on, can we do this? And having open minds to say, yeah, I'll give you a try. And same with the DU Prison Arts Initiative, it was having a warden who was open to new ideas, who was a transformative leader. I think he's just now stepping down, which makes me really sad, but was somebody who was a transformative leader and advocate who said, yeah, I want more prison programming. Pitch me an idea. Can we make it happen? So I'm not saying this all has to be well-researched or well thought out. Obviously, there are other models out there. There's tons of other prison arts programs throughout the country. And so some of our work was having partnerships and consultants to help us build what we were able to build in Colorado.
Whether searching out for outlets, or if you're invited to speak for an outlet, what kinds of things do you consider in choosing what media to accept or outlets to avoid?
I mean, that's a good question. And again, this is the second time I've gotten it recently. One is doing your research. For me, I follow a lot of local sources because sometimes that's where I want my work to be grounded. So I start getting a feel for what papers I would like to publish in the future, or what kind of style they have. I follow a lot of the reporters, so I know the types of stories that they engage in. So if your work centers on education, figure out who the reporter is who is on the education beat and seek them out, follow them. They start to get to know your work, and maybe that's the person you want to collaborate with. Even if they give me a call, I do a quick Google search. What are the previous stories that they've done? And that gives me some information. And then ultimately, is this in my wheelhouse? If I don't feel confident that this is truly in my area of expertise, I will give referrals for other people that they can call.
Wonderful. I suppose this is the perhaps the flip side of the discussions. Somebody asked, when social justice warriors target me, what should I do?
And that's always a challenge of what all these different terms and things like that. I think a lot of people have these concerns about social justice warriors. So one, am I even getting it right? That sometimes in the work that I do, there might be fair critique. And so I might be well-meaning and get criticized, and being able to consume that feedback. People also being concerned about trolls, which is very valid, that there are faculty members, even myself, where people have written the chancellor of my university about an article that I was featured in, or I think one of the op-eds I was published in, or published. So knowing that there are going to be consequences. And so I think for some people, gauging also, is your institution open to this? I was very grateful that my institutions have been very supportive in this work. And I think that goes back to your earlier question, Anthony, of early career folks. I've still heard that thing, not until tenure, which is a challenge for me. I said the public can't wait until I make tenure to see change. And so that's why I was willing to take that task on pre-tenure for myself.
Yeah, and I've always believed if you keep silent before tenure, you're not the same person post tenure that you were pre tenure anyway. So you're not gonna freeze in your stance, and then be ready at a certain magical time.
Mm-hmm. There's no right time to do this. Yeah.
Someone asked how we can approach court systems with educating about the roles of diverse professionals so they can understand what's appropriate or not. They give an example of professionals practicing forensic psychology without proper training, who transfer their training as, like, say, CPS workers into counseling or conducting parent evaluations. How would you approach advocating for the public in similar circumstances?
That's a great question. I think across all professions, because I know we have a lot of representation here today, we each need to talk about what it is we do. The public doesn't get it. And we've had some recent engagement about this on social media lately of what is the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and what's the difference in their training? Is one better than the other? And we know, I hope none is better than the other. We do different things. So this is part of some of the work. I think I alluded to this early on. Advocacy is also educational. So even the media work I do, I just want to educate and inform the public about these different issues. And I think part of this is we need to educate the courts on, what is it that we can do as our different professions? What is it we can't do? What is violating kind of our bounds of competence, I think is what you're also alluding to. And just being very clear about that with the courts. Even with forensic evaluators, I've had meetings with lawyers and done trainings with lawyers. I do a lot of training with public defenders because they don't know what we do. And they're like, oh, wait, there's an assessment for that. And so being able to inform them about our work is really important. So if you can, getting out into community, making these connections and doing these trainings, showing up to their public defenders conferences, all of that gives opportunities to kind of highlight our professional roles.
One wonderful perspective all around. People sending in comments appreciating the resources that you've shared. I love the resources. Thanks for sharing. Somebody did ask if you are accepting mentees in the upcoming future.
I hope so. I am taking a new doc student, I know, in this fall. So I hope to do more in the future. We'll make sure we get our information out. My website's not that updated, but aprylalexander.com to find out more about me. And you'll also have my contact information later.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Apryl, Dr. Alexander, for sharing this and your perspective with everyone, thinking about not only, the types of issues or audiences that we can reach out to, but how we might deliver this information to different people that that can influence the legal system as we can as professionals. That wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Join us next week when we have Dr. Natalie Anumba, who will be discussing equity issues in psychology and law. Hope you have a fantastic rest of the week, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.